On behalf of the UC Master Gardeners of Santa Clara County, I'd like to welcome you to summer vegetable gardening. My name is Sharon Erickson. I'm a Master Gardener volunteer here in Santa Clara County, and I'll be your moderator for tonight's session. The University of California Master Gardener program extends research-based information about home horticulture and pest management to the public. Tonight's program is being co-sponsored by the Palo Alto Library. We're grateful for their support. Our speaker tonight is Laura Monczynski. Laura has been a University of California Master Gardener volunteer since 2001. She's also certified as a master composter and a green gardener. She's been teaching gardening classes throughout the county for over 20 years in both Spanish and English. Her entire background is organic and edible, with about her entire backyard is edible, with about 20 fruit trees and 400 square foot south-facing vegetable garden and more vegetables and herbs tucked into pots wherever she can find space and sun. She sounds like one of us. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Laura for the presentation.
Thank you. I am one of you, and a lot of people on here are one of us too. So thank you so much for being here. And we're going to be talking about summer vegetables. As Sharon mentioned, we'll be doing questions at the end, but if you have questions on topic, you can post them in the chat, and we'll try to occasionally pause if there are some questions. We don't want people getting lost because something was not confusing. So anyway, we'll keep the chat pretty much for questions and answers, not for chatting, so that Sharon can get through what's in there. So since we're doing it online, I can't be talking to you when you come in to get an idea of who you are, but I will assume that we have a variety of gardeners on here. We probably have some people, I know we have some people who've been growing vegetables for a long time. I always still go to as many classes as I can because I always learn something new at every time. Some of you may be just kind of starting, and some are probably still trying to decide what to do. So I'm sure that there is a variety of people on here. Also, if you have something to add to what I'm talking about, go ahead and put that in chat, because everybody has different experiences, and we can all learn from each other. So what I'm going to be covering today with summer vegetable gardening is why, if you're still thinking about it, you're not sure, you know there's a drought, you don't know if it's a good idea to grow vegetables. It is, I think. But we'll talk a little bit about that, how you figure out what you're going to grow and where to grow it to have the best success. And most of what we'll be talking is the how-to, preparing to grow it, what you're planting and how to plant it, how to start it, how to plant it, how to get it in its final destination, and maintaining, because it's not just you get it in the ground and you have vegetables magically without doing anything. There is some maintenance to go along the way, and I'll talk about that. And harvesting, that's what it's all about, right? Although I used to sometimes forget to harvest. I love the growing process so much, I kind of forget that part, but that's really the most important part. That's what it's all about. And we want to make sure we harvest everything at the right time so that it tastes best. We're getting good production from our garden, because sometimes if you don't harvest it, it will slow down. And we also don't want to be wasting food, especially right now, because we're also wasting the resources that go into that food. Namely, water is the main one that's kind of on everybody's mind right now, that's in the newspapers every day. So benefits of growing your own food. This is just some things that maybe you're trying to figure out, you haven't really thought of yet. So I'll just mention a few of them for people who are still trying to figure out, or who have been doing it for a while and it's like, oh, do I still want to do it? So number one, fresh, nutritious, delicious. There's a song that says there's nothing like love and homegrown tomatoes. I mean, tomatoes out of the garden are just the best thing. They have so much flavor, and the nutrition is right in there. They haven't lost a lot of it by sitting around, by being shipped. There, you can choose varieties that don't have to store well, don't have to ship well. So you can get varieties that taste really good. I often tell people, if they're just starting to garden, if you grow one thing, grow a tomato, because that's, I think, where you have the biggest difference in taste between what you grow on your own and what you might get from a store. So there are some, some things that you have to consider with growing tomatoes, but to me, that's kind of number one. And you go out and pick it when it's still warm from the sun. Oh, wonderful. So different varieties. So if you're growing your own, and if somebody knows what these are and wants to guess in chat what these are. So when you are growing something on your own, whether it's from seed or even picking out in the nursery, you find a lot more varieties than what you might find at the store. So yes, Martha got this right. These are carrots. So you go to the store and the carrots are orange. You grow yourself. Apparently, the original carrots were purple, and the Dutch with their House of Orange kind of got the orange ones growing, and that's what's most common. But you can just grow so many different varieties if you grow them yourself. And also, if you have children and you're trying to get children to eat vegetables, give them a purple carrot. That's pretty cool. So that variety can really interest a lot of different people, including children, and makes it more fun. So that's one reason I like it. Organic, different people have different ideas about this. This is important to me. This is one of the main reasons that I grow my own vegetables, because I know what went into it. I don't really want to be eating pesticides. So if I grow my own, that's one way to help ensure that. It is getting easier and easier to find organic food, organic vegetables, a whole bunch of different organic things. So that is getting better, but that's one of the main considerations. I also do composting, and I'm careful about what I put in my compost bin in the backyard, because that's eventually going to go onto my vegetables, and I'm going to eat it. I have separate compost in my front yard for things that aren't necessarily organic, that might go on the ornamentals. But so I'm paying attention every step along the way: the soil, the compost, growing the vegetables, what I put on them, fertilizer. I'm paying attention to that all the way, because that's a priority for me. It's not for everybody else. And then the environment. A lot of our food is shipped on the average from 1,500 miles away. So that's a lot of oil, a lot of pollution that goes into that. This is something that is important to some people, and one reason they consider growing it on your own, just walking out to your backyard, is doesn't really pollute it much at all. So, and then just the fun part of it. So you can get all sorts of interesting things coming up in your garden, like on the right, these eggplants that are joined right here. At our Master Gardener monthly meetings, when we were doing in person, we often had what we called a brag table, where people would just come in and show something interesting they had grown, whether it was really big or whether it was odd or whether it was twisted weird. So it's just kind of a fun thing to do and share with your neighbors and friends. And sharing. So this is, for me, something I really enjoy when I'm growing food, is sharing it. Some people grow flowers and they share those. Now, I do prefer to share with human beings more than with the critters, but you have to kind of think that you're going to have to share a little bit. It's just a matter of how much. And I'll mention pest management just very briefly in this talk. If you want to find out more, it would be a whole nother area that you're doing it. So I do have a question about fertilizers, which I'll get to when I get to the fertilizer part. So thank you for that. And in terms of sharing, there's your own family, friends, and neighbors. Try not to grow more than you can share, because we don't want to waste that food and the resources that went into it. Sometimes food banks will accept food if you end up with too much. You didn't realize how much zucchini you were going to get, or whatever it was. So sometimes donations to food banks. There are organizations that will come out and glean and pick. I know they do mostly fruit trees. I don't know if they do that, but you want to try to plant the appropriate amount for your own household needs and the people who you can share that with. Squirrels, birds, we won't talk about those. Okay, So those are some things that maybe you're thinking about that maybe get you thinking about it. The one thing that I do want to say about growing your own vegetables that a lot of people are concerned about, I heard people talking about this the last few years, is the water use. So it is estimated that if you grow your own vegetables, you're only using maybe a quarter to an eighth of the amount of water that's used on vegetables grown commercially. So you think about it, you're going down Highway 5 or whatever, and you see all these overhead irrigation going on during the day. Sometimes up to 90% of that water can evaporate. If it's windy, if it's sunny, it doesn't even get to the roots. It doesn't even get to the soil and into the vegetables. They're picked in the field, they go to the market, they're misted every few minutes in the market. You bring it home, you wash it a lot because it's been handled a lot and you want to make sure there's nothing on that. So all of those steps along the way contribute to a lot of water. If you're doing it yourself, you're watering appropriately, and we'll talk about how to make sure that you do that, that you're just watering the roots and not wasting a lot of water. If you do that yourself, you pick something, you know how it's grown organically, you might just rinse it off, you might just stand out in the garden and eat it. You're not washing it as much probably as something you bought in the store. So there is really less water use overall if you're watering correctly. The thing is, it's on your water bill. So that's something that people can be concerned about. And when we're having mandatory restrictions, that may be an issue for you. So if you want to grow your own vegetables, just if you have a lawn, don't water it as much, or find some other way to save water. So in the big picture, it's a big water savings to do it yourself. So you just have to balance if you can handle that on your bill. Okay, so deciding what to grow. If you've ever picked up a seed catalog, you're going to be overwhelmed with choices. And so there are a few different ways to decide and to work it down. When you're looking at a seed catalog, I see one of these says Southern Exposure. That may be things that grow better in the South. So you really want to make sure you're looking for things that are going to grow well in your area. So some of the seed catalogs may have some of the conditions. Also, in terms of growing locally, I just do have a couple of resources to refer to you to. One of these is Golden Gate Gardening. So this is written by somebody in San Francisco, but she works with our Master Gardener program too to make sure that we have right planting times for our area. So something that grows well in our area. Couple different ways to figure out if they're not described in these catalogs is one, if you go to local independent nurseries, they're more likely to have the things that grow well in our particular area. If you go to a nationwide chain, they're going to have the same thing all over the country, and what grows well in a cold climate in the Northeast is not necessarily going to be the same thing that grows well here. So that's one way. Also, on our Master Gardener website, we have a section on vegetables, and it will list some of the varieties that we have found to grow well in this area. We have research and demo gardens all over the county, and we have them in warmer parts, like down in Gilroy, all the way up to Palo Alto that's cooler. We used to have one up in the mountains. So we have the various microclimates in the county because it's a little bit different in different parts. And so those gardens do experiments to see what grows well in that particular microclimate, under what conditions. We'll do experiments, things like growing cantaloupe with 4 different ways to try to retain heat, and then we'll publish those results. So that's another way to find out. Or just with your neighbors to see what they're doing well. Also, if you're saving your own seed, you're going to have things, you want to save the best seeds from the best fruit or vegetable. Technically, it's one or the other, and from the best plants. And then you're going to sort of be selecting for what grows best in this climate. So if you've been saving seed, or somebody in this area has been saving seed, That's another way to know what grows best in this area. So just because something sounds good in the catalog doesn't mean it's going to grow well here. Okay, so most important, what do you like? I mean, that sounds simple, but sometimes people are like, oh, that looks good, or somebody said I should grow this, but grow what you like. And consider what can you eat, and think about how much you can eat, but also different forms in which you can do it. I have a separate freezer in my garage, and I freeze a lot to last me throughout the winter. So I can grow more than I can eat during the season. If you don't have that, maybe only grow what you can eat during the season. This picture on the left, chili peppers. I love to grow different chili peppers, and some of them I'll dry and I'll grind them to make chili pepper, or not as fine and make chili flakes. So all the different ways you can preserve it, different ways to use it, will determine what you can grow and how much you'll grow. Fermenting is something that a lot more people are doing. That's been really popular. So kind of be creative in what you use and what you might plant. Maybe it's something you don't like to eat fresh, but maybe you don't eat cabbage fresh, but you love to make kimchi or something like that. So consider all those things in growing it. Also, availability. So grow things in your garden that are hard to find elsewhere. One of the things I've been growing the past couple of years, it was recommended by a fellow master gardener who works at a nursery, is wasabi arugula. Now that's something I never heard of before. I mean, arugula I know, but this has, you know, how arugula has that kind of peppery taste. This is like that wasabi Japanese horseradish taste. And it is delicious. It's really spicy. It's great on sandwiches and salad, a lot of different ways. I'm not going to find that at any store. Maybe some specialty store, but I've never seen it. So I use the land I have, the resources I have, the water I have, for things that maybe are hard to find elsewhere. And then the cost at the market. Growing chilies is one of my favorite things. I'll grow maybe a dozen different varieties each year. I no longer grow jalapenos because they are so easy to find and they're so cheap. And here's jalapenos 5 for $1. So I used to grow jalapenos because I like them, but I'm limited on my space, like a lot of us are. So I'll grow ají amarillo or chocolate habanero, or things that, if I can find, they're a lot more expensive. So just some ways that you might want to decide what you're going to grow. And then two of the most important things to us here. One is space. So most of us here in Silicon Valley, I think probably most of you are in Santa Clara County. There may be people from elsewhere, other parts of the country. That's one advantage of Zoom, is you can take a class anywhere. Most of what we're talking about will apply elsewhere, but in Santa Clara County, most of us have small yards. We're not on farms. We don't have great big yards. So we're kind of limited in what we can do. So we kind of have to be creative. One of our master gardeners, I was over at her backyard, and she had plants growing in containers on the diving board of her swimming pool. So if we want, we could be pretty creative about finding more space. But this is something that can be a little bit limiting. So some of the different ways we can address this is, one is to grow vertically. So I do that a lot because I can get more space. I'm limited on ground space, but air space, it can kind of go forever. So things like cucumbers, for instance, instead of having them sprawling all over the ground, taking up several feet of space, I grow them vertically on kind of a metal fencing. And so I don't need as much space in the ground. I need to space them far apart that there's enough room for the roots. So there are limits. I can't put them an inch apart. I have to leave space for the roots. But vertically, I can get a lot more into a small space. And one example of that sort of thing is called bio-intensive gardening. Or some people use square foot gardening, where you can get a lot in a very small space. And there are different creative ways of doing it. There's something called the Three Sisters, for example. And this considers it's a Native American way of doing it. It takes into account space, but also nutrients. So people grow together corn, squash, and beans. And so you have the corn that kind of acts as a stake. The beans can kind of grow up that and it counts as a trellis. And then you have the squash around it with the big leaves that produce shade. And then you have the beans, for example, are legumes. They pull nitrogen into the soil. And then the squash, for example, has that soil to use. So you can plant those in a small space and they support each other physically and nutritionally. And it's just one of the ways that you can get a lot in a small space. You need enough room for roots. You don't want to have so much that you have competition, but you can be pretty creative about planting things together that will support each other more than they'll compete with each other and get that vertical space. Also, containers is another way to get space if you don't have a whole lot of room in your garden, or maybe you don't have any garden. Maybe you have a balcony. Maybe you're in an apartment or condo and all you have is a balcony. So containers are a great way to plant vegetables, and you need a large enough container for the plants. Some of the bigger ones, maybe tomatoes, you might want a 15-gallon container or a half wine barrel because they tend to be bigger and roots grow deep. But something like lettuce, you could just do in a standard flower planter that's in the window because you don't have the roots that grow that deep. So that's part of what limits you with how much you can plant together, is needing space for the roots, because that's where water and nutrients come up with. And then there are community gardens. So if you don't have space at all where you live, rent a space in a community garden. And there are a lot of them all over. A lot of them have waiting lists, so you may have to wait a few months or even a couple of years, but there are more and more of those. So a lot of different ways you can find space. Also, you mentioned containers. You can have containers on wheels that you can move around to get the sun. So a lot of little tricks. Where there's a will, there's a way. So first you decide what you want to do and then try to be creative about finding a way to do it. And really key right now is water requirements. So I figure this is called watermelon for a reason, right? It uses a lot of water. You only get a few off of a vine. So this is pretty water intensive. It's delicious. It's wonderful. I grew this a few years ago, but I'm not currently growing watermelons because not just the space they take up, but the water they take up. That's more of an issue right now. So one thing I did last year, and one thing that's fun about gardening is the experimentation. And one of my favorite phrases in gardening is there's always next year. No matter how you mess up, you just learn from it and move on and do something different next year. And you just keep getting a clean slate with a little experience, good and bad. So last year, I planted a couple different kinds of squash. I planted summer squash. So I had some zucchini and crookneck in those, what we call summer squash. Just means that they have that thinner skin and you eat them right away. What we call winter squash grow at the same time. They don't grow in the winter, they grow in the summer also, but they develop a harder skin and they can be stored over the winter. So summer and winter squash both grow in the summer. One gets stored over the winter. So last year I grew all of this summer squash, zucchini, a couple different colors of zucchini and the crookneck. And I also grew butternut squash because I really love butternut squash and it can store well. In fact, I just used the last in some butternut ginger soup a couple of weeks ago that was from last year. I also recently had some zucchini out of my freezer that was from last year. So I try to grow enough to make it through the year to get me to the next season. But with the butternut squash and the zucchini, for example, those plants, I was giving them about the same amount of water, maybe a little bit more for the zucchini, but about the same amount of space they take up because I grow them vertically, about the same resources. But With the butternut squash, a few plants, I got about 6 total for the whole season. With the zucchini, I was getting zucchini every day. So for the same amount of water, I was getting a whole lot back from that water input with the summer squash, the zucchini. And it was just, I mean, the butternut squash was delicious, but I decided that's not really worth the water in a drought. So I'm not growing winter squash this year, but I am growing summer squash. So that's kind of my decision about water use. Okay, choosing a location. So number one in choosing a location is the sun. You may think it's where you have room. It's not, it's where you have sun. So most summer vegetables need about 6 to 8 hours a day of full sun. And that's quite a bit. And so you may not have a whole lot of sunny spots in your yard. So there are a couple things that you can do to take advantage of the sunny spots you have. And keep in mind when you're looking at it, that the sun is going to be different. The patterns are different in the summer than they are in the winter. And you can even find an app where you can find out exactly on your property where the sun goes at different times of the year, if you haven't had a chance yet to be in your property for at least a year and watch where it goes. But places that are shaded in the winter may have full sun in the summer. So you need to know what's going on year round. So a couple tricks you can do to get a little extra sun. One is have them in containers and move them around. If you have one area that's sunny in the morning, and then if you're home still at lunchtime, you can go and move them to another place to get the sun, maybe have them on wheels to make it easier to do. Also, sometimes having them against something reflective that can reflect extra sun, maybe against a light colored wall, will reflect sun, give them some extra sun. What else can you do? We don't really have room to terrace, but some people can terrace in a way that it changes the angle of the sun so they get more sun. There are also reflective mulches that you can use that will get more sun up onto your plants. So there are different things that you can do to get extra sun, but that's really important. Now, there are some things that we grow that don't need as much sun as perhaps watermelon or peppers or tomatoes, things that developed in more tropical climates and are accustomed to a lot of sun. So some of the things that maybe don't need as much sun that you can kind of get away with are the leafy green vegetables like spinach, bok choy, lettuce, because we tend to grow those as cool season crops when it's not really sunny. So you might be able to do those in a little bit of shady place. When I talk about growing lettuce as a cool season, some of those plants, when it gets hot, they will bolt, which means they put up a seed stalk and they go to seed really quickly, and then they start to taste bitter. So they'll grow during the summer, but they may go to seed quickly. But if you grow them during the summer and they're not in as quite a hot spot, you may get a little more time before that happens. Also, root vegetables, many of which we tend to grow in the cooler months, and you may grow them in the spring and the fall, maybe not in the heat of the summer, maybe they'll go through the heat of the summer. But if they are in a shadier place where it's not quite as hot, you can get away with those also. And then some herbs also don't necessarily need full sun, like cilantro or parsley. So those are some things that you might be able to do. But there are a lot of the really traditional summer vegetables grow well with different sun. And when I talked about them being from tropical climates, with any plant, knowing where it originated, where it developed, will tell you what the requirements are. If something developed in a tropical area, that tells you it's going to do better with heat and sun. If it developed in a forest, and I'm talking vegetables and other things too, it'll do better with shade. So knowing where it originated, what conditions it developed under will help tell you what to do. So this little picture at the bottom. So if you don't have a sunny part, you can provide artificial light. So these are habanero peppers growing inside the terminal at Chicago O'Hare Airport. So these are grown hydroponically, so they don't have soil in here, but they have water and the nutrients in there and lots of light to make up for not having sunlight. So there are things that you can do to extend and improve what you have. So different places you might grow them, and advantages and disadvantages of each. So there's no right and wrong. It's based on what you have, what you're growing, what you want to do, what's easier for you to do. And so somebody asked, are there discussions on the Master Gardener side on edibles that don't need as much sunlight? So that was some of the herbs and roots and leafy greens don't need quite as much. So another resource, I have it up on the, oh, I have it right here, is the Western Garden book. So this is something, if you know what the plan is, you look it up in here and it will give you information about what the sun needs are, what the watering needs are. So you can look up that information there too. Okay, so some of the pros and cons of, or just things to consider. So growing right in the ground. I mean, the ground's already there. It's free, the soil's already there. The roots have a chance to go deeper, so they may be able to find more water, find more nutrients. So that's an advantage of doing it in the ground. Some of the disadvantages are the soil here can be hard, and I'm going to talk about soil. And in Santa Clara County, we mostly have this hard clay soil, which is actually a wonderful thing to start with, because it holds on to water and nutrients really well. So it's a wonderful thing to start with, but we do want to improve it. And we'll get to that shortly, how to improve it. So another disadvantage to the ground is a lot of the pests are right at ground level. So you may want to be a little careful that way. Sometimes I will start mine in pots and then put them in the ground once they're bigger and stronger and not as vulnerable to things that live under the ground or right at the surface. Another is raised beds. So I know there's somebody on this call who recognizes these raised beds. This is somebody's backyard, lot of raised beds. I just love this garden here. So some of the advantages of raised beds is you have better control of the soil. If you're planting in the ground, you kind of have what's there, you can amend it. Also, if you've just moved into a property and you don't know what was in that soil, or if there was just construction on the property, maybe you want to wait a little bit to do that. With a raised bed, you can put in exactly what soil you want. Also, some pests are easier to control. So the pests that dig, like gophers that might dig under, if you're making a raised bed, go ahead and put hardware cloth at the bottom of that. That's kind of like the 1/2-inch metal kind of screening. It's like a thick screening. So things like worms and all those beneficial critters that live in your soil, the beneficial fungi and bacteria and all that can get through. Water can get through, but those pests like gophers and moles cannot get up in there. So when they dig in, so that's another reason a lot of people like raised beds, especially if they're in an area with a lot of pest problems like gophers or ground squirrels. Also, the soil warms up earlier in the spring, so you can go ahead and plant a little bit earlier. So when we talk about when it's time to plant things, it's partly the temperature of the air, but it's largely the temperature of the soil. That's where the roots are. That's what feeds the plants, pulls up water and nutrients. And so if that is really cold, that's really stressful on those roots, and it may be harder for the plants to grow. So it may be warm during the day, but it's too early in the season for the soil to have warmed up for the plant to really develop good roots and take off. So the raised beds will give you more time. So these are becoming more and more popular. Also, people don't have to bend over as far. or they can kind of sit on the edge. You can see there's a place to sit. So that's another consideration for people. And of course, this looks really nice and neat. It's easy to have walking paths in between if you have the beds. And then you can raise those beds as high as you want. So this is the demonstration garden for the Fresno County Master Gardeners. This is called Garden of the Sun. And they have these wheelchair beds. And as I've gone around to the newer community gardens, they all have several of those raised beds because more people are wanting to not bend over, or they can't bend over. There are here in South San Jose, the Marshall Cottle Park, where Master Gardeners have a big presence there, and research and demo gardens. And there are community gardens that the city of San Jose opened up about a year ago. And they have several of these really high beds where people can just stand and work. So I see that more and more frequently. As somebody said in the chat, raised beds make gardening easier for physically impaired individuals. So that's a great benefit. And there's more awareness of that now. Containers. So containers can be instead of a bed or the ground. It can be in addition to. I actually use all three methods. So I've got this garden, 20 by 20 foot garden on the side where I'd had a deck taken out, and I have plants in there. And then there are certain things I put in containers for certain reasons. Things that tend to have soil-borne diseases that I want to be able to change out. If it's in the ground, it's harder to do. And also I can get more, fit more in there, and maybe find a sunnier spot too. So a couple things that you want to do differently with containers is you really want to make sure that the soil in there is loose. So you don't want to take that native hard clay soil out of your garden and stick it in the container. If you do that, especially if it dries out just a little bit, you're going to have cement. It's going to be really hard to work with. So in containers, you want really nice, loose, fluffy soil. That's going to give you the best bet. So you're putting in a pot, you put in potting soil. So that's kind of a way to do it. Now, I sometimes in my larger containers will mix some of that with some compost, maybe a little bit of native soil, just not solid native soil, but I'll add a little bit in, partly because it's free, and also it retains water better. If I have something in a big pot that's just a really loose potting soil, water may drain through too quickly, and I really want and take the nutrients with it. So I really want to hold on to that. One thing I've done too in my larger containers, like the 15-gallon black pots, like you see in this picture, this is not my garden, but I will put clay soil in the bottom of it so that the water goes down through, but it doesn't run out the pot too quickly. So, and then I'll put a mix going up in. So this person, this is another master gardener, and in his yard, you can see those big trees in the back, which completely shade the area where the ground is. So he can't plant in the ground because there's no sun there. However, his hardscape patio has sun, so he plants things in containers so he can plant them in the sun, because he knows that the sun is more important than the ground. You can control the soil that's in the containers, but you really need that sun. If he planted things in the ground, a lot of the tomatoes and peppers and eggplants, cucumbers, all those summer vegetables wouldn't grow well because they don't have enough sun. So that was an area where the only space he had sun, he had to do containers. So different reasons people do containers. And if you have only a limited area, you only have hardscape, you only have a back deck, you only have a balcony, or you only have a kitchen window that you put plants, containers will help you out there. Come in all different sizes and shapes. And you want to make sure the container is big enough for the plant that you're putting in. A bigger plant that's more likely to have an extensive root system is going to need a bigger container. I do use containers for my tomatoes, but I use 15-gallon or half wine barrels because if you just put them in the ground, those roots may go 6 feet. So they don't have 6 feet in the container, but those are the biggest containers I can find that I can actually deal with. So maybe they won't grow as big. Maybe I won't get as much production. But if I get a soil-borne illness, I can just take that soil out, clean out the container, and start over. Whereas if I put them in the ground and I get a soil-borne illness like verticillium wilt, that's going to stay in the soil for a few years. So if I plant that in there the next year, it's not going to do well. So when you hear people talk about rotating crops, so there are basically 2 reasons people rotate crops. One is if you get some kind of disease that stays in the soil and you plant the same thing or something from the same family in that space, all those critters have been waiting for their favorite food to come back, and you're going to have a lot of problems the next year. So if you wait 3 years, the population of that pest will be down enough that you're not really going to have a problem. So tomatoes, chilies, peppers, eggplants, and potatoes are all in the same family. So if I get a problem with my tomatoes, I cannot plant anything in that same family for at least 3 years. It'll live longer, but the levels are going to be high enough. And then the other reason for rotating crops is some crops use a lot of one nutrient, and it kind of needs to be replaced. Like lettuce uses a lot of nitrogen. If you rotate it with beans that are a legume that fix nitrogen in the soil, that's how you get enough balance. So I see Sharon here, so she may have a question or a comment.
So I just wanted to pop in and say that Joyce had a question about self-watering containers. Do you have any experience with those? We have 4 of them up at the Palo Alto demonstration garden.
And do you like them?
Yes, we like them a lot. So the self-watering containers, you fill a reservoir on the bottom. The ones we have are called earth boxes. I think I've seen them on sale at local nurseries lately. They use a lot of water, but it's only water that the plants are absorbing. So you actually put kind of a shower cap over the top of the earth box to keep the moisture in. But we grow tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant in those kind of containers frequently. Because we have trouble with the soil. Sometimes we get the wilt when we plant eggplant in the soil. They're also nice because they warm up early in the season. So we've already planted, we plant a couple of eggplants in one of the containers. We planted up to 6 peppers. They were kind of miniature peppers in one of the containers. So it just depends. They do require a lot of fertilizer. It can be organic, but they do require fertilizer.
Yeah.
Anyway, I hope that helps, Joyce. But yeah,
anything in a container is going to need more fertilizer because it uses it up as opposed to if it's in the ground
and I saw that Joyce posted something from the Handyman magazine, so I'm hopeful that she has somebody lined up to help her build containers.
Yeah, that's great. We did a project several years ago together with the United Nations, starting a garden at Google that the kitchens could use, the cafeterias there. And this group from the United Nations that we worked with, they use earth boxes all over the world to grow plants in deserty, poor areas where there's not a lot of water and they can just have it all contained in that. Also, rooftop gardens are another place to do it. So they use the water, but they don't waste the water because it's not evaporating. It's not at the top. It's at that reservoir underneath. So I agree with Sharon. That's a really good way to go. So thank you for that question. That's a really specific one. So that's good. Okay, so the soil. So that's kind of related to where you're planting it with the soil. So our Santa Clara County soil is mostly clay soil. So the soil, we think of it as being all solid, but this on the left here, only about half of it is solid. So half of it is pore spaces for air and water. And you want that about half and half, the air and water. So you can see from that little picture, if it's filled up with water, waterlogged, it's not getting enough air. So the organisms, the roots are not getting the air they need, and they can rot or kind of go anaerobic or drown. If it's all filled up with air and you don't have enough water, of course, they're gonna dry out and die. And then that organic matter, 5% is a good amount of organic matter. That comes from compost. It comes from the leaves falling and decomposing in place. So it comes from mulch, organic mulch is breaking down. So a lot of the soil that hasn't been treated is but maybe 2%. So we want to get it up to about 5%. So amending the soil is really good to do. The next slide, I'll have some ways to amend it. So the mineral portion of it. So when we talk about clay soil, silt soil, or sand soil, those are all the exact same thing. Sand is exactly the same as clay. It's just a different size. So it's that mineral element in there just broken down differently. So sand, you can see and feel a grain of sand. So those particle sizes are very big, which also means the pore spaces in between them are big. So when you water, and the water and the nutrients that it carries just go down really quickly and they disappear. So you have to kind of water more frequently, not more water, but more frequently, because it disappears really, really fast. The clay particles are very small. You can only see them with a microscope. And so they're very small. The spaces in between them are small. And so they can get easily compacted. You have to be careful not walking on clay soil when it's wet. But you have more surface area. And then also with the negative charge of them, it holds onto nutrients and water really well. So it's a great thing to start with. But when it gets compacted, it can be hard to absorb water. It can be hard for the roots to get through. So amending it with compost or a looser soil can help make it easier for you to work and easier for the roots to get through and easier for water and nutrients to percolate down through the soil, but not too fast. So on the bottom, this was just an experiment we did with one of our classes where 3 people poured in water at the same rate, the same amount of water. And you can see on the left, the clay soil, it takes a long time for that to go down through. And a lot of it kind of sits on the top. So that's why whatever you're watering, if it's clay, you don't want to water too much too fast because it can't absorb it. It takes longer to do, but it stays in there longer. And so you don't have to water as frequently. So, give it time to get down in. It'll hold on to the water. You don't want to water as frequently. And then you can see on the right with the sandy soil, the water just goes right through and everything disappears. So we kind of want something in the middle of it. So if we've got naturally silt soil, which may be in Willow Glen along the riverbed, you might, but most of us have clay soil. So we kind of want to add to that. So different ways to improve your soil. On the left here, this is a truckload of horse manure. This was actually a birthday present for me, great present for a gardener, right? And so a well-composted manure from an herbivore. You don't want animal manure from anything that eats meat because they can have pathogens that can be passed along to humans. So an herbivore, something that just eats vegetables, is great. If it's well composted, you can mix it right in your soil. If it's fresh, the nitrogen level is too high. It can burn your plants, especially tender young plants. So you can compost it first, or you can put it on your soil. Maybe if you're only doing summer gardening, you can put it over on the winter. So the rain and the worms can help it work down in. But you don't want to put fresh soil on tender young plants. But that's one good way to do it. Another is composting. So this in the middle, put your food scraps in, put your garden waste in, and break it down into this really nutrient-rich humus that will, it's more of a amendment than a fertilizer. It's not really high. If you do worm compost where you feed the special kind of worms your fruit and vegetable scraps, then that's more of a fertilizer because it's higher in those nutrients. But compost is a good natural way to loosen your soil, to make it easier to work, to improve your drainage, and it has some nutrients itself, but it will attract more of the worms and all those beneficial organisms that then help keep your soil healthy. So you develop this whole sustainable system. And this is one book that's really good with information about composting if you really want to get into it. Also, through University of California, we have a Master Composter program, and we have free classes. They're an 1.5 to 2 hour classes, Saturday mornings, evenings, all different times. So Sharon she posted the book, but she will also post the link to that site if you want to take a composting class and how to do it. Another way to do it is this cover crops. So lots of times in a community garden, if you go in the winter, you'll see a lot of fava beans. And fava beans, like the beans I mentioned before, they're in the legume family, and they have a bacteria on their roots that helps pull nitrogen from the air into the soil and will increase the nitrogen in your soil. So you're growing something, but you're also improving your soil at the same time. So people will do that. They'll chop it up, put it in their compost, or mix it directly into the soil. The key is to get the most nitrogen, to do it when it's flowering, about 50% in flower. Because if it starts to produce the fruit, if it starts to produce the fava bean pods, then the nitrogen goes into that. You don't have as much in the plant. So what I do is I plant half and half. I'll plant fava beans, half of it's for the garden, half of it's for me. But this is another way. And there are buckwheat, there are a whole bunch of different crops at different times of the year you can do to grow things that will feed your soil. Also, it keeps your garden from having bare soil. If you only grow vegetables in the summer, in the winter, you don't really want to have bare soil because you'll get erosion and it'll dry out and those good critters that live. So that's another way of protecting your soil. Okay, irrigation. So this is something that you want to figure out before you plant, so you know how you're going to water them, so that if you have to dig or whatever, you have a system in place. A lot of different ways to do it, and a lot of it is personal preference. The drip irrigation on the left, that's becoming more and more popular because when you water, the key is to get the water to the root. You don't want the water evaporating in the air. You don't want it, running off all over. You don't want it below the roots. You don't want it sitting on the foliage. You want it at the root level. So if you have distinct individual plants like peppers or tomatoes or even ornamental bushes and the like, having drip emitters at each plant means the water goes to the root ball of that plant. And you can set those up to go automatically. Any irrigation you want to change at least monthly because conditions will change as you go along throughout the year. And in the summer, it'll need more, but it's not just seasonal or twice a year. It's recommended to do it every year. And you can get all sorts of charts that tell you how much different plants need. But anyway, you can go ahead and set something like that up. Soaker hose is something good for if you have maybe a line of lettuce, a row of lettuce or something that are really small plants. You don't want to have drip emitters, but maybe they're in a line or in a circle or something like that. That's something that a soaker hose can be good for because it comes out all along there. Another way is hand watering. So hand watering, now this is not a really good example because the foliage is getting watered and it's also not going in the pot. So some is wasting unless there's something else growing in there. But one advantage of hand watering that I really like is you're out there in your garden paying attention. And so sometimes if you have something set up on automatic and you only get out there on the weekends or once in a while, there can be a pest or a disease that comes in and it can be damaging your crops and you don't know because you haven't seen it. If you're hand watering, you're out there observing, and observation is a really important part of gardening. so that you can catch things early, so that you know if there's a problem, so you know if there's success, if things are growing well. So this is, I like this kind of head. It's like a dram head. I don't know if that's a general term or a brand, but you can get with 400 little holes or 1,000 little holes. And so it kind of spreads out the watering, so it's not like a jet right on the plant, or washing away the soil. And you can see it's on a wand, so you can get down to where the roots are without bending over. So you do want to water regularly. If plants get dried out too much and then just get soaked, that's going to be stressful on the plants. So you want to do it regularly. And regularly depends on so many different things. When I'm starting something out from seed, I'm going to be watering it every day. And then when it starts to grow, maybe every couple of days, and then maybe once I get it in the ground, it might be once or twice a week. It depends on what the plant is, on what your soil is, on what the weather is. But you want to water it regularly. There are some things that you see, like blossom end rot, where the end of a tomato start to get maybe brown or gray and a little mushy. And that's a lack of calcium getting all the way through, but it's really not so much a lack of calcium in the soil as it is not regular watering that's helping get that calcium up through the plant. So for a lot of reasons, regular watering is important. And then early morning is generally the best time to water, because it gives time to soak in before it gets hot and starts to evaporate. Evening is the second best because you don't have that quick evaporation, but you might end up having water sitting on the foliage, and that can cause fungal infections if it's moist and warm and it stays moist for a long time. So if you water in the evening, it's not going to dry out until mid-morning, then the next day. So the early morning is kind of the best balance, giving it time to get down in, not evaporating, but not sitting on the foliage. But you have to go with what works in your schedule. Maybe your hand watering the only time available is when you get home from work. So you just have to balance everything. So these are some guidelines, but it's not rules that you have to do it a certain way. So just kind of giving different ideas. Okay, so Sharon, is there anything you want to break in with about watering? Or
no, I think we're good.
Okay,
it's 8 o'clock, so we're
okay, terrific. So in terms of the source of where you're going to get your plants, so this is one thing I set up. If you have $3, you can go to the store and get some zucchini and have dinner that night. Or you can go to the nursery and get a transplant and have a plant that produces enough to have zucchini maybe once or twice a week. Or if with the same amount of money you get seeds, you can feed the whole neighborhood. So that's just one of the factors to do it. So one is starting plants from seed. So this is one way to do it. I like to do that because it's fun for me to see things grow from seed. I can usually get more varieties and I can start them earlier. And so this is one way that I like to do it. So when I'm starting from seed, some things that need a long hot growing season like chilies or tomatoes, I might start indoors as early as February to give them a little bit of time to grow while I wait for the soil to be warm enough to put them in the soil. They're not going to germinate in the soil that early because it's not cold enough. So you need pots. If you have them inside, you want trays so that when you water, it doesn't go over. Potting soil, so you want a loose soil. Now there is something called seed starting mix. Which is a lot more expensive. You really don't need that unless you have something really delicate, hard to start. You might want to do that, but usually it's potting soil is fine. Some kind of heat source can help with some of the things that are harder to start that normally grow in tropical areas, like some of the chilies. You can get seed heating mats. This on the left was an old electric heater for a water bed. People will sometimes put them on top of the refrigerator. Now refrigerators are energy efficient, so they're not giving off heat, but it is warmer towards the ceiling. Maybe windows, you want them kind of in a warm place. Labels, and then it's really important, especially if you're doing it indoors, to have a light source because they're not getting sun, so you kind of have to give it as close as you can get to the sun. So once they germinate, that's when you want to put the lights on, and just leave them a couple of inches above the top. So this is an adjustable home built contraption that it can be moved up as the plants grow. Putting them in the window will give some light. Not ideal, not enough, but it's kind of better than nothing. So whether you're starting them indoors or outdoors, make sure they have some kind of light. So read the seed packet. It'll have all sorts of information on the back about how deep to put the seeds, how far apart, thinning them, what time of year to put them. I put this because this is a local seed company, so they're up in the mountains, so they're going to be geared towards our local. If you don't have the packet, a rule of thumb is plant it 2 to 3 times the diameter of the seed, because there'll be some food stored in the seed, enough to get it to the surface. So a bigger seed will have more food in there. It will have more energy to get to the surface. A smaller one, not as much. So that's kind of a rule of thumb if you don't have the packet. So you want pots that are clean. So if you're doing used pots, clean them out with a 10% bleach solution is one possibility. So it's 1 part bleach to 9 parts water, and clean those out to get rid of any pathogens that are in there that might kill the plants that come up. I make sure that before I put in the pots, it's wet. So I'll put the soil in a bucket of water, maybe overnight, because potting soil takes a while to absorb that water. It gets hydrophobic, and it's hard for water to get in. So if I put that in and then I put the seed and then I try to water, it's going to be really hard to get it watered. So that's why I try to make sure the soil is wet in advance. And then go ahead and plant the seeds. So if you ever looked inside the seed, this one on the left, you can see that little kind of little leaf, a little root. It's called a radicle when it first comes out. So you can see that the little part of the plant in there, right there. And then all the rest of that is food to help it get to the surface. You can see this is big. It has a lot of food. You can plant this maybe 1 inch deep. And so on the right, you can see when it starts to germinate. And make sure you don't let it dry out, because it's not big enough. It doesn't have a lot of water held in there. It's got this really small, delicate root. And you want to make sure it stays wet. If you're home, you can spritz it a few times a day. If you're not, maybe cover it with some plastic wrap, poke holes in it to make sure it doesn't get dried out when that seed coat opens and it first starts to come out, because it's not gonna, it can dry out and die really, really quickly. So make sure you don't let it dry out. When it's bigger and stronger and it's got more root and it can hold more water in the plant, it can get away with a little bit more. And then germination. This is the exciting part. This is when it starts to come up. And so these are kind of the seed leaves that come up first. And make sure you get some lights on there, whether it's indoors or outdoors, mimicking sunlight. So I'm growing these here, you see, in an unnatural environment, but I want to mimic nature as much as possible. So with any plant, the more you can mimic nature, I mentioned know where it originated, but know how much sun it gets, know the temperatures of it. And as close as you can get to following what it does in nature, the more success you're going to have. So when are they ready to transplant? So those first leaves that came out, these are called cotyledon leaves. They're the ones in there. And then the first true leaves are the ones that can photosynthesize. So plants are autotrophic. They create their own food through photosynthesis. And so you can see, like in this front bottom one, the first set of true leaves are even a different shape and form, so that you can pretty well tell that they're true leaves. And so once they have those true leaves and they can feed themselves, basically get their own sun. Now you're adding minerals and other nutrients, but they get the sugars through the sun, through photosynthesis. They can be transplanted anytime after that. Now, I like to wait until they're bigger and stronger to put them in the ground. You see these ones in the back are bigger and they're ready to transplant in the ground. And so lots of times what I'll do is, especially if I'm starting them indoors, I'll start them maybe in a 6-pack. where it's not taking as much space indoors. And then as they get a little bit bigger, maybe put them in a 4-inch pot or something like that. If it's still not warm enough outside to put them in the ground or in a bigger pot, then I'll move them to a 1-gallon pot. So every time they're having a little more root space, growing a little bit more until they're ready to put in the ground. Now, I don't start everything indoors, depends on what it is, but the plants that need that long warm season, I'll give them a head start by putting them indoors before it's warm enough to do anything outside. And then hardening them off, getting them gradually used to outdoor conditions. Some people will withhold water to make them stronger. I don't really do that, but I'll put them outdoors a little bit at a time because they've been indoors. They haven't had really direct sun. They haven't maybe had wind. Now, some people will put a fan on them indoors to kind of simulate those outdoor conditions. But I'll put them out maybe for an hour, or maybe I'll put them out in dappled shade before I put them in full sun, and just kind of gradually get them used to being outdoors. Because if you change too much at once, it shocks the plant and it really stresses it. So only changing a little bit at a time and making those changes gradually. So here's an example of taking longer to transplant. So on the left, these Peruvian purple peppers were all started from seed at the exact same time. So you see that as I up-pot them to larger pots, they have more room for the roots to spread out, get more nutrients, and grow a bigger plant. So the tiny one on the left and then that bigger one in the middle, they were started at the exact same time. So it's just a matter of giving them the conditions to help them grow. And then this plant on the right, you can see once it gets into the ground and can get more nutrients and has more room, not only does it grow bigger, but it's growing greener. So it's getting more of the nutrients you need. So don't wait too long to transplant them. And if the soil's not warm enough or wherever you're going to put them isn't ready or in the air, put them in a bigger pot to hold them until then. So lots of times it'll be May or June when the soil is warm enough to put some of those summer vegetables in. And then you can skip all that and you can just start from transplant. So you can go to the nursery and get transplants. So a lot of that is already done for you. You haven't spent all that time giving them light, giving them water, taking them in and out easily. You can just go to a nursery and get them already started. Now it's going to be a little more expensive, but you've saved a lot of time and work too. So you want to look for healthy seedlings. You don't want to look for the tallest ones necessarily. Short and stocky is actually better than tall, and we call it leggy if they're really tall and thin, because they're not getting enough light. They're kind of looking for the sun. It's actually a plant hormone that makes it grow on the other side. But anyway, it'll grow leggy and it can fall over and it cannot be as strong. So you don't want to look for the tallest ones, but you want to look for ones that have good color. They've got those good nutrients. You want to look for something that hasn't been root bound, hasn't dried out a lot. So sometimes people will gently take them out and look at the roots and make sure that they've got a good strong root system, that they're not brown, that they're not rotten, that they're not smelling, that's not so root bound that it's been stressed. If it gets stressed early on, it can have kind of troubles all along. And then direct seeding is another way to do it. So some, especially the bigger plants or the plants that don't need as much time, you can just go ahead and put those right in the ground. So I do that with, for instance, my squash, where I've got these bigger seeds. I do that with beans. And I certainly do that with root vegetables, because whenever you transplant something, you're going to damage some roots. So if it's a root vegetable like a carrot and you damage the root, that's kind of damaging the vegetable. So some of the things where you don't want to risk that damage, you would put right in the ground. So make sure you label it. You think you're going to remember what everything is, but you don't always. So put a label, and you can put whatever you want on that label. I usually put what kind of vegetable it is and maybe the variety. And then I will have in a separate place on a spreadsheet or something, I'll have more information about it. maybe the brand of seeds, what year the seed packet was. Seed packets will always say packed for a certain year, but they can last a few years longer than that, most of them, as long as they're stored in a kind of cool, dry place. They don't get wet, they don't get too hot. They can usually last longer than that. And you can put the date you planted it, you can put the date you transplanted it, you can put all sorts of stuff in a journal or spreadsheet or something like that. There's not a whole lot of room on the label. I tend to use, you may have noticed one of the pictures, those kind of popsicle sticks or craft sticks, and you can get them in a craft store for like 1,000 of them for $7, and then you can throw them in the compost bin later because they're wood. Some people make them from yogurt containers or window blinds. I mean, you can just use whatever you want or buy fancy labels, but make sure that there is a label so you remember what it is. And then if it's something that needs support, do the support early. Don't wait until it's too big, because then you're going to break things trying to wrestle in. You may do some damage to the roots as you put something in. You may break off branches. So go ahead and put in that support early. Whether it's beans, anything that grows on a vine or grows big and heavy, put that in early. And then when plants are young and tender, I mentioned I wait a while to transplant them so they're bigger and stronger. But if it's something you started right away and it's young and tender, provide some kind of protection, maybe a row cover, something like that to keep birds from coming in and eating it, or some of the big pests. There was one year I planted my lettuce in the ground 4 times and something kept eating it. Well, now I grow it in containers. So as I realized that wasn't going to work. So there are different things you can do to protect it, but especially when they're young and tender and easy to eat. They don't need as much when they get bigger and stronger. And then water regularly. So you want to, I mentioned getting down to the root zone, that's where you want to water, but you want to know what's happening at the root zone also. So there are tensiometers on the left that you can get a really accurate, or you can just go to a nursery and get a cheap $8 moisture meter that has a sensor on the end of it. So as you put it down in the soil, you can see what's happening at different levels in the soil. So what's happening at the surface is not necessarily what's happening at the root level. So for instance, if it's watered and then the sun comes out and dries out the surface, it may look dry, but it may be holding on to that water underneath, especially if it's clay soil, for a long time. So you may be watering because the surface is wet, but the roots are getting soggy. Or the other way around, it can look wet on the surface because you watered for a short time and really lightly and it never got to the root. So you need some way, it can be your finger, it can be a screwdriver or whatever, to make sure you know what's happening at the root level. And maybe once you get to know your plants and your soil and your conditions, you kind of get a feel for how much to water, and you don't necessarily need to measure as much. But especially in the beginning, you want to do that to make sure you're getting the right amount of water to the right place. So basically what you're doing is replacing the water you lost through it being hot or windy. Those are all things that make plants lose moisture. So all you're doing really is replacing what it lost. So here's plants can be tricky though, so you kind of have to know. So plants have on the lower part of the leaves, they have stomata, which are like pores that vapor in water forms comes out. They kind of breathe through the pores a little bit. Is a simple way to do it. But some of these plants with large leaves, the stomata, they have guard cells on the sides that will close them up when it gets hot to try to hold the water in. And with those cells on the lower part of the portion of the leaf closed, it makes it look like it's wilting. It's not necessarily a lack of water. So that's why you need to know what's going on in the soil. So these were some squash that were really wilted on a very hot afternoon, but I knew that there was enough water down at the root level. So I did not water them. And you see a few hours later in the evening when the sun's off, they're all perked up. If I had just gotten tricked by the plants and watered them, they would have been overwatered and soggy. So this is, plants do a lot to adapt to try to survive. So fertilizing plants, if you're using a packet, follow the label. It's not always good that more is better. In terms of organic versus synthetic fertilizer, the main kind of thing with that, people have different ideas about it, but organic fertilizer feeds the soil and it feeds those organisms in the soil, and you develop this sustainable system. If you use a synthetic fertilizer, and somebody put a question in there earlier about Miracle-Gro synthetic fertilizer. So we're not talking about this one particular, but just synthetic fertilizers in general. They'll feed the plant and get the nutrients to the plant. The plant's really happy, but it's not good for the soil around it. So you just have to keep giving it over and over. It kind of becomes like a drug because you don't have soil life that's supporting. So feeding your soil so the soil can feed the plant on an ongoing sustainable basis is a really good way to go long term. So on fertilizer packets, you always have NPK, the 3 numbers. So the first number is nitrogen. So that's for the green growth. If you're planting lettuce or something like that, you need mostly that. Phosphorus is for fruits and roots and flowers. So a lot of what we call vegetables are actually fruits botanically because they are the reproductive part. They have the seeds like tomatoes, cucumbers, squash. So, you know, a tomato fertilizer may be 573 or something, a bigger middle number. And then potassium, just kind of an overall strength thing. And then mulch, you want to hold in that moisture, keep the sun from baking it too high and damaging the roots, and then cooling off too much. And you don't have weeds germinating as much. So sometimes waiting a little bit until the soil warms up naturally from the sun, adding the mulch. If you put something like this wood mulch, you don't want to dig that in. You don't want to turn that in at the end of the season, because with the whole compost process, if you know compost, it's kind of a balance between carbon and nitrogen. This is carbon. When it breaks down, it's going to need nitrogen to help it break down. It will pull that from the soil and pull it from the plants. And nitrogen is what we need the most of in our soil, because it is more mobile and it doesn't stay in the soil. Some of the other nutrients will stay in there. So that's why we need to add that more. So we don't want to be losing it by having that carbon source. On the surface, it's fine because it's not in contact with much, but you don't want to dig that in at the end of the season. Controlling weeds, because they will compete for water and nutrients. They can also harbor pests. Some weeds, though, this is purslane on the right, it's one of my favorite things to eat. So a weed is somewhat subjective, but make sure you get them before they go to seed so that the water and nutrients go into your vegetables. Controlling pests and diseases. Look on our website if you want a pest and disease. That's a whole different 2-hour class. So I try to do a strong jet of water will take care of a lot of things. A lot of insects breathe through their skin, so smothering them with something like a little bit of soap and water, a little bit of oil and water is a more organic way to do it. But that's a whole nother class. I always like to include, people know how wonderful ladybugs are, but they don't recognize all the different phases of them. So you don't want to just squish anything that crawls, so know what things are. So we have on our website this planting list specifically for Santa Clara County, which will tell you what is good at plantings for certain times of the year. So some people might say, oh, it's the end of May, it's too late. It's not too late. You might get a shorter growing season for some things, but it's not too late. So if you look at this chart, January, February, March, April, May, so you go down, peppers, yes, potatoes, maybe, pumpkins, yes. Radishes, yes, summer squash, winter squash. So there are plenty of things you can still plant now. So I use this all the time still. It's like, oh, it's May, what can I plant? Or I want to plant this, what's the best time to do it? So that's I think one of the best resources on our website. Sharon.
Laura, can I stop you there? Swati had a question about that. They're wondering what vegetables can they plant now?
Right
so
here.
and should they plant seed or transplants?
So it says on this list too. So go to our website. I think Sharon posted it here. So if it's in the yellow, yes, you can do it. So for instance, if you have summer squash, yellow, yes, transplant, yes, direct seed. So it's all right there. So this is specific to our county. If you live in another area, contact the Master Gardener program in your area. But this gives both transplant and seed, and when it's a good time to plant it.
And Laura, the second part of that question was, where would you buy seed and or transplants?
I would go to a local independent nursery because they're more likely to have what grows best in this area. You know, if you go to a big box store, they buy the same thing, they get the same thing nationally. So also go to our website that will have a list of some of the varieties that go best in this area. But I think the local independent nurseries are most in tune with what does well in this area. And they've got people who are knowledgeable who can answer your questions too. So that's where I like to get both seeds and transplants. Just a couple quick things on some of the most common things that we grow here and things you might want to look out for. Tomatoes, we mentioned they get some wilt problems, so I grow them in these large containers and use the concrete reinforcing wire as support for them. Tomatoes and peppers are the only things that you can transplant deep. When you transplant, you want it at the same soil level that it was in the container. Tomatoes, though, have the ability to grow more roots along the stem. So here's one you can see where the soil level was in two different pots as I transplanted it. But tomatoes and peppers are the only things you can do that with. Some of the problems you might get, the wilt problems that live in the soil. So you want to change the soil or plant them in a different place. Don't plant them in the same place every year. Blossom end rot, I mentioned calcium because of water not carrying it all the way through. So that's why it's important to water regularly. I find that paste tomatoes get more of those. So I don't even plant paste tomatoes anymore. Tomato hornworm, they can eat a lot of foliage and really quickly. So sometimes you find those you find the frass, kind of the little insect excrement below them. That's one way you can find them because you can see they're designed to blend in. Peppers, they can get sun scald if you don't have enough leaves on them. So sometimes people grow them together, maybe put more nitrogen earlier so they get more of that green growth. That's a common thing with peppers. And sometimes some of the insects will eat part of the peppers. They seem to eat less of the hot peppers than the sweet peppers. So that's one reason I like to grow hot peppers. And hot peppers too are used as a natural pest repellent because a lot of them don't do that. Beans. The one thing that I really want to emphasize with beans is pick them regularly because this is actually a fruit. It's got the seed in it. If you let it go to seed, if you stay on there too long, it thinks it's completed its life cycle and it will stop producing. So peas, beans, make sure you harvest regularly. And squash is the last one here that's grown commonly. Two problems people tend to have a lot with squash is sometimes it'll start growing and then it will stop, so it's not getting pollinated. So squash has male and female flowers. So the one that's on the fruit is a female flower. It needs to be pollinated by the male. If it's not happening naturally, you can take a toothbrush or a Q-tip or whatever and transfer it. And then they almost always get powdery mildew at the end of the season. You can look up pest notes on that to get some ideas of what to do. There are some varieties that are resistant, but usually by the time that starts to appear in the fall, when the weather conditions are right, you've had enough squash anyway. So I just pick off the most infected leaves because they won't photosynthesize anymore. So hopefully this is what you'll end up with. You'll go out in your garden and pick a whole bunch of beautiful vegetables, and this is what your summer will look like. And I just wanted to put up here our website. We do have a helpline where you can write in with gardening questions, include pictures of the problems you're having. We also have a monthly plant clinic the second Saturday morning of the month. Second Saturday from 10 to 12. So you can find that on our website. A lot of other events and classes. We do have about 5 minutes left. Sharon, are there questions we'd like to address?
Yes, I was just putting something in the chat for everybody. So for help answering gardening questions, go to our webpage and you can get information about different things there as well. We did have one question. I think you've covered most of them. Gabriel wanted to know, at what point do you fertilize during the season?
Oh, that's a really good question. So when they're young, when they're seedlings, the fertilizer will always have directions, but when they're really young, do half strength fertilizer. Don't really do a lot of it. And then kind of follow the directions. Part of it depends on what kind of fertilizer you're using, and partly on how fertile the soil is. If you have a lot of compost in there, if you have worm compost, somebody asked about worm composting in the chat I saw, and that was something that is actually a fertilizer, counts as a fertilizer. So if you have this nice fertile soil, you've got a lot of earthworms that are kind of pooping and making more fertilizer as they go, digging tunnels and stuff like that, you won't need fertilizer nearly as frequently. So part of it depends on the condition of your soil, how you've been treating your soil. If it's been used up or if it's a new soil, you'll want to add it more frequently. But a lot of fertilizer, maybe every 2 weeks or once a month would be kind of a general rule of thumb. But the more you have that sustainable system that I talked about, the better off it is without fertilizer. If you're using synthetic or you don't have good soil, or if it's been exhausted, you may have to do it more, but never do more than what it says on the package.
Right, please read the label.
Oh,
So-
and this is a really good one. I just want to say, would you plant flowers into the vegetables? Yes, because then that helps attract pollinators to pollinate your vegetables. So that's a great thing to do. And there are some things that I will let go to seed. There are flowers that are known for attracting pollinators, but I find I get the most ladybugs and pollinators on things like if I let my cilantro go to seed, if I let my celery go to seed, if I let my carrots go to seed. So I'm getting the flowers with the vegetables if I just let them go to seed. But yes, you need them somewhere to attract the pollinators, which will provide natural pest control in addition to fertilizing your plants.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our time with you. Thank you all so much for being here, all of you who joined in on this call. I know Zoom is a little different than being in person, but it is fun to be able to get together even by Zoom. Thank you, Laura, for this great presentation. I want to thank the Palo Alto City Library for co-sponsoring the event. And again, to all of you for attending and for your questions. For additional information, please see our website, mgsantaclara.ucanr.edu. You can get information there from our help desk. You can see what events are coming up. And with that, I think we'll say good night, take care, and happy gardening, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for gardening.